Welcome to Module 10. This module focuses on ocean life, and we kind of call it Ocean Life 1. Just to let you know, this module as well as the next one, the PowerPoint presentations are quite long. Definitely feel free to listen to it for a while, take a break, do some other stuff, and then come back to this. There are many different topics that are covered within this module. We start off with looking at the basics of biological oceanography, move on to talking about what productivity is, what phytoplankton and zooplankton are, features of large marine plants, then move on to talking about energy and nutrient transfer in marine ecosystems, follow with a classification of marine environments. So how do we talk about the environments that we're looking at in the ocean? Do a short introduction to marine communities, and then look specifically at some of the ways that organisms have adapted to living within the ocean. We are now focusing on biological oceanography, and the first thing we should take a look at quickly is how life is classified. We found that all life on Earth, depending on whether you're a bacteria or a plant or an animal, an invertebrate, a vertebrate, a fungi, all life belongs to what we call three domains or three super kingdoms. These domains are archaea, very simple basic life forms. Another domain are the bacteria, single cells without a nucleus. And then the final domain are the eukarya, and these include things as diverse as fungi, animals, plants, as well as one and many celled organisms that do contain a nucleus. What are the differences between these three domains? Well, quite simple. The eukaryote, so we're an eukaryote. A whale is a eukaryote. A crab is a eukaryote. We all have cells, and these cells have a nucleus, sort of a central part within the cell. The other domain, bacteria, typically these are single-celled organisms. They do not contain a nucleus. In the archaea, this is a really unique group of organisms. And what we see is that they're very similar to bacteria, but their DNA makes them a distinctive class apart from bacteria. And within the eukarya, we usually see the extremophiles. We've talked about the extremophiles a little bit, but these are the organisms that can live in extreme environments where there's no sun, extremely hot temperatures, different food sources that they need to utilize in order to live. The study of the classification of life is known as taxonomy. And basically what taxonomy does is it tries to classify something. It tries to take an object, take an organism, and say, you belong to this group. Any named group of organisms is known as a taxon. That's singular, tax is plural. And we find that we have this way, this sort of almost like a nesting doll way of classifying different organisms. What we see when we look at this classification scheme is we go from very broad details, characteristics, to very specific, very distinctive characteristics that form the species level. Each species, for example, this is the lowest level that we see here, has a unique collection of observable traits that aren't shared with other different species. So you start off with the domain, those are the three that we just talked about, and then we go down to things such as kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, and species. Genus and species we're probably the most familiar with. We talk about how humans are Homo sapiens. Homo means the genus, sapiens means the species. This classification of life is hierarchical. It's a nested scheme. Once again, we can see here we have how dogs are classified. So their species is Canis lupus. Canis, once again, is the genus. Lupus is the species. And we find that they have many shared characteristics with the wolf. We can actually put dogs in a very even more specific category known as a subspecies. But as we work through the bottom of this list, so we have the domain, you can see how the domain includes this wide range of animals. And then we get more specific characters until finally we land on the dog. What is a species? A species is a group of individuals that can actually or potentially interbreed in nature. So they're able to produce viable offspring. Here we have an example of a species, the happy-faced spiders. They all look different, but they all belong to the same genus and species. Theridion gralater. They look different, but they can interbreed, so they can produce offspring. What Theridion gralater is an example of a scientific name. It's the way that scientists used to talk about different organisms with each other so everyone is on the same page. And you'll find that every organism on the planet, either marine or living on land, will have a unique scientific name. Who came up with this theory of how we name things or assign a scientific name to an organism that consists of the genus and the species? Well, you have this person here, Carl Linnaeus, or Carolus Linnaeus, to thank. He's a Swedish botanist. And what he came up with is this binomial naming system, this usage of the genus and the species. So for example, once again, here we have this organism called a Christmas tree worm. And we know that the genus here is Spirobranchus. So that means that members within that genus look alike, but they're infertile, they can't interbreed, whereas the species, Giganteus, those specific members can interbreed. So that's a little bit of basics of how we classify organisms, or how we discuss organisms that we find in the ocean. The next thing we're going to look at are different ways that we can classify marine life. So in this case now, we're not going to use things like genus and species, but we're going to classify them based on how they live or where they live within the ocean. We can classify marine organisms on the basis of how they live and how they move. And there's three broad classifications: the plankton, the nekton, and the benthos. And we see examples of all three of these in the image of the water column to the right of the slide. So plankton, organisms that belong to the plankton sort of group, or known as being planktic, ones that adrift with ocean currents. So these ones really don't have the ability to swim. They can't sit there and they can't flip flippers or flap a tail and propel themselves through the water for the most part. There are some that can. Those are the exceptions. But basically, they drift with ocean currents. They float around the ocean currents. But as we'll see, they're a very important member of the marine community. They form the basis of the marine food chain. The next sort of way we classify organisms, the next group of organisms based on how they move, are the nekton. We as humans, when we swim within the ocean, we are part of the nekton. So these are organisms that can move independent of ocean currents. The currents might be pushing you one way. You can swim up and against the current and go in the direction that you want to. Organisms, for the most part, are nekton, are swimming organisms. Like fish, you can see turtles that use their flippers as paddles. You even have things like squid, which use water as a means of propulsion. The final group that we see are the benthos, or the benthic organisms, and these are organisms that live on or in the seafloor, so just directly below the surface of the ocean floor. Another thing that we have to consider when we talk about biological oceanography is how to define a living organism. So how do we tell the difference between something that's living in an environment or something that's non-living in a marine environment? And here we have an example of a rockfish to the left and a rock to the right. So with the exception of, kind of being able to sort of pick out the fins on this fish and maybe guess where the eye and the mouth is, if you kind of like squint and look at it with blurry eyes, it's very difficult to pick out the differences between these two objects. We define a living organism in a number of different ways. So in this course, what comprises a living marine organism is one of these four things. It has to change over time, change over geological time. So in a sense, we're seeing an evolutionary change, or seeing it evolve. It has to have, and this is probably the most important one, the one that we'll focus on the most in this course, and it has to have the ability to capture, store, transmit, and convert energy. We need energy to live and to carry out all of our bodily functions. It also has to have the ability to reproduce and the ability to adapt to the environment that it's living in. The ability of an organism to change over geological time was nicely summarized by Charles Darwin when he wrote The Origin of Species in 1859. And he's known as the father of the concept of evolution, that over time, organisms with favorable traits will pass those traits down to their offspring, which in turn will then pass those traits down to other offspring. So we see these favorable traits that allow you to live effectively within an environment, are passed down. You're successful, you pass those genetic information down to your offspring. So Charles Darwin came up with this theory based on observations he made within the Galapagos Islands and other places, and he's known as the father of the concept of evolution. If I haven't said that already, I apologize. As a result of this, that we all share this common ancestor, and from this there's been many adaptations, and life has evolved as it is on the planet today. Here we see an example in the lower image here of how we see organisms change over time. These are very early primitive fish. We see it going from a very basic fish, like there's no body plan, there's no fins, there's no discernible mouth or eyes or anything, to over time, maybe an adaptation and mutation resulted in the fact that some of these organisms developed these sort of sensory organs. All of a sudden that became, hey, we can see or sense where food is. So that trait was passed down, that organism is successful. And finally we get to the point where we get fish, jawless fish, and they eventually evolved into the fish we see today. So the big thing here is favorable traits are passed down through subsequent generations. Another really excellent example of how organisms evolve over time is that with the evolution of the whale. And what we see here is actually, if you go back into the past history of the whale, is the whale's ancestors used to live on land. They lived on land, they started to hunt for food near the water and realized over time that if they went into the water, they had better access to food resources. And this is what drives quite often a lot of biological or evolutionary change, is the desire for new food resources or to exploit a new source of food. So these early ancestors of the whale started to return back to the water. Their legs eventually became flippers until we see the modern day whales that we have today. So way back in the history, the whales represent organisms that were on land and then returned back to the water. We'll look at some other ways that define a living organism. We're not going to worry about how an organism reproduces. A little bit later on, we'll talk about how organisms can adapt to changes in the environment. But right now, we're looking at a very important topic, and that's how organisms capture, store, and use energy. So if you get right down to the ultimate source of all energy on this planet is the sun. The sun is constantly hitting the earth at some point during the day. And of the sun that hits the earth, about only 1 part in 2,000 is actually captured by living things and converted, which convert that sunlight into usable energy. All organisms, or I should say most organisms, there are a few exceptions, use some form of the sun's energy to live. What we need, though, in the initial stages, we need an organism that can take the sun's energy and convert it into usable chemical energy. So we as humans can go out and stand in the sun. We might get burned, we might get warmed up by the sun, but we can't actually take the energy within the sun's rays and convert it to a form of energy that our bodies can utilize, for example, like sugars or carbohydrates. So in order to take the energy from sunlight shining on the earth, we need to have organisms that take that sunlight and transfer it into a chemical form of chemical energy that then we as consumers can eat. And this is done by something that we call primary producers. We'll focus more on primary producers in a couple of minutes. What they do through a process called photosynthesis is they take the light, they capture the light in specialized cells called chlorophyll. We see some of these in this image here of the slide, and they convert that light energy into chemical energy. These primary producers, these organisms we'll get a look at in a couple of minutes that take the sun's energy and create chemical energy from it, are known as autotrophs. Autotrophs are primary producers that make their own food, which is then a source of chemical energy. Everything else on the planet, so we as humans, are known as heterotrophs. We cannot make our own energy. What we have to do is we have to either eat autotrophs or eat other heterotrophs, and from that we obtain the energy. This is what we do. We're hungry, eat food. That food gives us energy to carry on with our life. One final thing, a trophic relationship is basically a relationship relating in terms of food or nutrition. Let's take a look at these autotrophs, these organisms that either via photosynthesis or chemosynthesis are able to take energy and convert it to chemical energy, and the rate at which this can occur. So this is something known as primary productivity. We're going to focus a little bit on photosynthesis and chemosynthesis, and then look at the primary producers in a little bit. One example of primary productivity is photosynthesis, and photosynthesis represents by far over 99% of the way energy from the sun is converted to chemical energy. So what we see here is certain organisms, usually very small organisms, but we'll find that some can be larger, use the sunlight's energy, and from that, in a chemical reaction that involves carbon dioxide and water, using within the cells, their chlorophyll, they're able to create glucose as well as oxygen. So this is why, we talk about plants, they convert carbon dioxide to oxygen, replenish our atmosphere with oxygen. About almost 100%, 99.9% of the ocean's biomass, so all the biological material of all living organisms within the ocean, the mass of all living organisms, rely on photosynthesis as a source of the energy. This is what they use to eat. So we need photosynthesis to happen in order for organisms both in the ocean as well as on land to eat. We also have a small portion of organisms that need to rely on chemosynthesis to obtain energy. And these are organisms that usually live in deeper water. Sunlight won't penetrate. We're within the aphotic zone. And what they do is they use energy released by inorganic chemical reactions to produce food. So for example, here in this image, we have a hydrothermal vent, one of these black or white smokers. We have 2 rooms there. And what we see happening here is that we have carbon dioxide dissolved in the water. We have water that combines with hydrogen sulfide that's being produced at these black smokers. And from that, we get the production of sugar and other sulfur compounds. How can we talk about primary productivity? How do we measure primary productivity? Well, primary productivity can be expressed as the grams of carbon per meter squared per year. So the grams of carbon bound into organic material per square meter of ocean surface area per year. So that amount is going to vary depending on where you are in the ocean, how much sunlight's reaching the ocean at that location, and how many of these small primary producers are living in that particular part of the ocean at the time. Typically, if you look at the example here, we're looking at a meter by meter squared cube of section of ocean. And what we see is that within this ocean primary productivity, we're using diatoms, the chlorophyll within the cells of diatoms, to produce this energy through photosynthesis. We'll take about 120 grams of carbon and bind it into molecules of glucose each year. That's one organism, but think about there's millions and millions and millions of them within the water column. So you can just see how very quickly we can produce a large amount of energy. To go out in the ocean and measure primary productivity, you do something such as a plankton tow. This is sort of a hands-on method. What you do is you have this net, and basically you tow it alongside or behind a ship, and it collects all these tiny microscopic organisms. These primary producers are in the water. Then you take a look at it, and from that you determine what the productivity levels of that particular area of the ocean are. This is a diagram of the type of net that's used when doing a plankton tow, known as a plankton net. And basically what you see is you see an open mouth, and at the end of it, it's this conical shaped net like fabric or mesh. And what happens is it allows water to pass through it, but it traps any small organisms that you want to be measuring. Basically what happens is everything else ends up in the net bucket, and from there you count, you determine how much of a particular primary producer or autotroph is in the water, estimate the volume of water that you sampled, and then you get a sense of what the primary productivity of that water is.